15 years ago, Walter Cole stood in his own kitchen, kissed his wife goodbye, and told his daughter he'd be home by dinner. He never came back. No car found, no note left behind, just a $14 million hole in the family business, and a little girl who waited by the window every night for a father who wasn't coming. Last Tuesday, a stranger knocked on that same front door. Older, thinner, wearing a coat too heavy for the weather. When the woman inside opened it, she didn't recognize him at first. Then she screamed his name. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. For 15 years, this town believed Walter Cole was a thief who ran with a fortune that wasn't his. His own brother swore to it under oath. His own daughter grew up hating a name she could barely remember. But the man standing at that door that night wasn't running from justice. He was walking straight into it, carrying something that would tear his family's carefully built story apart, piece by piece. To understand what happened at that door, you have to understand three people: Walter Cole, the man who vanished; Marcus Cole, his younger brother, and the man who built a life out of Walter's absence; and Diane, the wife who spent 15 years raising a daughter with half a family story. Somebody in this town knew the truth the whole time. The question was never really whether Walter Cole took $14 million from the company his family built. The question was why a man with everything to lose would rather disappear than defend himself, and what he'd been protecting for a decade and a half. In 1988, Walter and Marcus Cole started a construction outfit with one second-hand pickup truck and a bank loan their father co-signed against his own house. Walter was the older brother, the one who showed up first and left last, the one every crew foreman in the county trusted with a handshake instead of a contract. Marcus was different. Sharper suits, faster talk, a taste for rooms Walter never cared to enter. For years, that difference worked in the company's favor. Walter built the reputation. Marcus built the relationships. Together, they turned a two-man operation into Cole & Sons, one of the largest construction firms in the state, with municipal contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. By 2005, the company had grown faster than either brother expected, and growth like that comes with debt. To win a contract to rebuild a stretch of the regional highway system, Cole & Sons took on financing that put the entire company on the line. Walter wanted to slow down. Marcus wanted to keep signing. Somewhere in those disagreements, Walter started keeping a second set of records. Not to hide anything, his family would later say, but because he'd started noticing numbers that didn't match what Marcus reported at quarterly meetings. He never told his wife about the ledger. He barely told himself what he suspected it meant. At home, none of that tension showed. Diane remembers those years as some of the happiest of their marriage. Sunday dinners at the same table every week. Their daughter, Emily, just starting middle school, convinced her father could fix anything with a toolbox and enough patience. Walter Cole, by every account, was a man who kept his family's world steady. But steady things can crack quietly, long before anyone notices the sound. In the fall of 2009, employees at Cole & Sons began whispering about missing invoices, about numbers that got fixed after the fact, about Marcus staying later at the office than anyone could remember him staying before. Walter heard the whispers too. One night in late October, Walter sat at his kitchen table long after Diane and Emily had gone to bed, going through his private ledger page by page under a single lamp. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. It rang 11 times. Nobody answered. 3 days later, Walter Cole was gone. The morning Walter disappeared started like any other. He woke before sunrise, made coffee the way he always did, and told Diane he had an early meeting downtown. Nothing about his voice, she'd later tell investigators, suggested a man about to walk out of his own life. At 7:14 that morning, Walter's truck was caught on a gas station security camera, 40 miles outside town, far from any job site on his schedule. He filled the tank, bought a coffee, and paid in cash, which employees said was unusual for a man who normally used a company card for everything. By 11 that morning, he'd made a stop at the regional bank branch, where he withdrew a sum of money from a personal account he rarely touched. The teller who helped him said he seemed calm, almost rehearsed, like a man checking items off a list rather than a man in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. What happened between that withdrawal and nightfall has never been fully accounted for. What's certain is that by evening, Walter hadn't come home for dinner, hadn't called, and wasn't answering his phone. Diane assumed a job had run late. By 10 o'clock, worry had replaced assumption, and she called Marcus. Marcus told her not to panic. He said Walter had mentioned needing space, that the two of them had argued about the business a few days earlier, and that he'd probably gone to clear his head. It was the first of many stories Marcus would tell over the following weeks, and none of them would fully agree with each other. 2 days later, Walter's truck was found abandoned at a rest stop near the state line, nearly 200 miles from home. The engine was cold, the doors were unlocked. Inside, police found his phone, powered off, and nothing else. No suitcase, no note, no sign that a man had planned to leave forever, or any sign that he hadn't. That same week, the company's accountant discovered that $14 million had moved out of Cole & Sons' operating accounts over the preceding 18 months, funneled through a series of transfers that all, on paper, traced back to authorizations bearing Walter's signature. The timing, next to his disappearance, made the story write itself for everyone in town. Word spread fast. By the following weekend, the local paper had run a front-page story naming Walter Cole as the prime suspect in what investigators were calling one of the largest embezzlement cases the county had ever seen. Diane read it standing in her own driveway, holding a newspaper with her husband's photograph on the cover, understanding for the first time how quickly a town decides who someone is. Reporters started calling the house. Neighbors stopped meeting Diane's eyes at the grocery store. Emily, only 12 years old, came home from school one day and asked her mother if her father was a criminal. Diane didn't have an answer that felt honest, because at that point, she genuinely didn't know. Marcus, for his part, gave a statement to police that would define the case for the next 15 years. He said his brother had grown erratic in the months before he vanished, that Walter had access to every account, and that he, Marcus, had no explanation beyond the obvious one. "My brother took everything and ran," he told the detective assigned to the case. "I don't know what else you want me to say." What Marcus didn't say, that night or for years afterward, was that he'd been the one making the transfers himself, using access codes tied to Walter's login credentials, codes Walter had shared with him years earlier out of nothing but trust between brothers. The investigation that followed consumed the next 3 years of Diane Cole's life. Forensic accountants combed through company records looking for a trail that led somewhere, anywhere, that Walter might have gone. Detectives interviewed employees, vendors, even distant relatives, searching for a pattern in a man who, by every account, had never shown interest in disappearing. Early leads went nowhere fast. A sighting of a man matching Walter's description at an airport 3 states away turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. A tip that he'd been seen crossing into Canada led investigators to a truck stop clerk who admitted, under questioning, that he'd simply wanted to be part of a story everyone in the country was suddenly talking about. Meanwhile, the financial consequences of the missing $14 million were devastating Walter's own family. With the company's accounts frozen pending investigation, Diane lost access to funds she needed to keep the house. Within 18 months, she and Emily moved into a rented apartment across town, carrying only what fit in the back of a borrowed truck. During a search of Walter's home office, investigators uncovered the private ledger he'd kept in his final months, but several pages had been torn out, their absence leaving a gap right where the timeline mattered most. One line, still legible, referenced a transfer Walter apparently hadn't authorized, made nearly a year before he vanished. Nobody at the time connected what that might mean. The lead detective on the case, a man who'd spent over 2 decades investigating financial crimes, would later admit that something about the numbers never sat right with him. The transfers were too clean, too evenly spaced, more consistent with someone managing a long game than a man making a single desperate decision. But without Walter to question, and without the missing pages of his ledger, the case had nowhere left to go. After 3 years without an arrest, without a body, and without a single dollar of the missing fortune recovered, the investigation was formally suspended. Walter Cole remained, on paper, the county's most wanted fugitive, a man the courts had all but convicted in absence. Life in town moved on the way it always does. Cole & Sons was sold off in pieces to cover outstanding debts. Marcus, remarkably, avoided any serious financial fallout, using what remained of his reputation to start a smaller firm under his own name. Within a few years, he was, by most measures, one of the more respected businessmen in the county. Diane raised Emily largely on her own, working 2 jobs to keep them afloat, never quite able to explain to her daughter why the man in old photographs had chosen, according to everyone around them, $14 million over the 2 of them. Emily grew up carrying a version of her father built entirely out of newspaper headlines and other people's certainty. 15 years passed. The story of Walter Cole faded into the kind of local legend towns keep without meaning to. The cautionary tale parents told about trust and money and the people you think you know. Nobody was searching for him anymore. Nobody expected an answer would ever come. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday in March, a bus pulled into the county line, carrying a single passenger who stepped off wearing a coat too heavy for the season, carrying nothing but a bag and 15 years of a story only he had lived through. Walter didn't go home first. He walked, according to witnesses who recognized him almost immediately despite the years, straight to the county sheriff's office and asked to speak with whoever was still handling his case. It was not the entrance of a man running from consequences. It was the entrance of a man who had been waiting 15 years for someone to finally listen. What Walter told investigators that afternoon rewrote everything the county believed about the case. He said that in the year before he disappeared, he'd discovered his brother quietly transferring company funds into accounts he didn't recognize, disguised through paperwork that used Walter's own credentials without his knowledge. When Walter confronted him privately, Marcus denied everything and warned him not to make accusations he couldn't prove. Walter said he'd started building his own record specifically because he feared exactly what eventually happened, that the transfers would be traced back to him instead of his brother. He said that in the days before he vanished, he'd received a warning, vague but unmistakable, suggesting that pursuing the matter further would cost him more than his reputation. Terrified, and with no one in his life he felt he could safely tell, Walter said he made the only decision that felt survivable at the time. He withdrew what savings he had, left everything else behind, and disappeared before the company's finances could be traced back to a signature he never gave permission to use. He spent the next 15 years working construction jobs under a different name in towns far enough away that no one would recognize him, moving every few years whenever he felt uncertain about how long it was safe to stay. He said he'd followed news about the case from a distance for years, watching his own name become a story the county told about greed and cowardice. What finally brought him back, he told investigators, wasn't confidence that he'd be believed. It was a safety deposit box he'd left untouched for over a decade, containing the missing pages from his ledger, the same pages torn out before police ever searched his office, kept as the only proof he had that the story everyone believed was incomplete. Investigators reopened the case within days. Forensic accountants who examined the recovered pages alongside company records from the period found exactly what Walter had described, a pattern of transfers that began nearly 2 years before his disappearance, each one authorized using his login credentials at times when phone records placed Walter somewhere else entirely. When detectives brought the new evidence to Marcus, his composure, built carefully over 15 years of respectability, began to unravel in real time. He denied the accusations at first, then grew evasive, then, faced with financial records even his own attorney couldn't reconcile, stopped answering questions altogether. Marcus Cole was arrested 6 weeks after his brother's return, charged with fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction tied to the original investigation. The trial that followed drew attention from across the state, a story of 2 brothers, one who vanished under suspicion, and one who let him carry the blame for 15 years, while quietly building a life on what his brother lost. The trial revealed something nobody, not even Walter, had expected to find. The $14 million taken from Cole and Sons hadn't been spent, hidden offshore, or gambled away over the years everyone assumed Marcus had enjoyed it. It had been sitting, largely untouched, inside a private trust Marcus quietly established years earlier. The trust wasn't in Marcus's name. It had been set up, according to the paperwork uncovered during the investigation, in the name of Emily Cole, Walter's daughter, structured so that it could only be legally accessed after both brothers had died, a safeguard Marcus apparently built, in case the truth ever surfaced the way it eventually did. For 15 years, the fortune everyone believed Walter had stolen from his own family had, in a strange and complicated way, belonged to that family all along, waiting under his daughter's name without her ever knowing it existed. Emily learned she'd been the unknowing heir to her father's supposed crime on the same week she finally learned the truth about why he'd left. The reunion between Walter and Emily happened quietly, away from cameras and headlines, in a small house on the edge of town. Diane was there too, cautious but present, watching her daughter meet a father she remembered mostly through other people's version of him. There were no easy words for 15 years, only the slow work of learning to trust a story that finally made sense. Marcus was convicted on all major charges and sentenced to serve time proportional to the scale of what prosecutors called one of the most damaging financial betrayals the county had seen, not because of the amount of money involved, but because of who he let pay for it in his place. Diane, after 15 years of carrying a version of her husband she wasn't sure was true, chose to slowly rebuild a relationship with the man who returned, though both of them agreed that the years between couldn't simply be erased by an explanation, however honest it turned out to be. Walter, now in his 60s, started over the only way he knew how, taking on small construction jobs under his real name for the first time in a decade and a half, working alongside a daughter who was, for the first time in her adult life, getting to know the father she'd spent years being taught to resent. What this story leaves behind isn't really about the $14 million, or even about Marcus Cole's 15 years of carefully maintained respectability. It's about how easily a family, a town, an entire county can decide who someone is based on the story that's easiest to believe, and how long the truth can wait, quietly, for someone brave enough to bring it home. If the people closest to Walter Cole couldn't see what his own brother was capable of for 15 years, it raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with. Would you have seen it coming, or would you have believed the story everyone else was telling too? Let us know in the comments at what point in this story you suspected the truth wasn't what it seemed. Was it the missing ledger pages, the timing of the transfers, or something about Marcus Cole's story that never quite added up from the very beginning? If this story kept you thinking, wait until you hear what happened to the family who discovered their missing father had been living 3 towns away, under a different name the entire time, working construction for the very company that replaced his own. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one.